Hey guys, welcome to another video from Sanatan Dharma. In this one we'll talk about the four yugs, the Kalyuga, the Dwaparyuga, the Tretayuga and the Satyuga. Guys, have you ever thought about who built the fantastic structures like the pyramids and the Sphinx and the Kailasa temple in Ellora? If you read the Bible, what explains the claims that people lived 900 years or 1,000 years? What really led to the starting of these monotheistic religions like Judaism and Christianity? What about the religions that preceded them, like the Roman and the Greek religions that nowadays we call mythology? We've all heard of the age of Aquarius and how the New Age movement thinks we are moving towards unity consciousness. Is that really going to happen, or are we going to destroy ourselves? Is there a central theory that can explain all of these? That's what we want to find out, guys. So guys, the theory we're going to talk about is the theory of the four yugas or the four epochs, which form a complete cycle. So this theory in Hinduism or Sanatan Dharma is based on astronomy. So there's a black hole in the center of the Milky Way called the Vishnu Nabi in Sanskrit. And black holes are the source of most of the gravitational energy that we see in space. And gravity affects the way consciousness makes us up. So just like the moon affects the tides and affects our moods, our distance from this black hole affects how close we are to unification. Now the sun takes approximately 24,000 years to complete one revolution around the Vishnu Nabi. And this corresponds approximately to the 12 zodiac signs. So in 1894, Sri Yukteswar Giri, who was the guru of Yoganand Paramhans, yes, the same person who wrote Autobiography of a Yogi, that Yoganand Paramhans, his guru wrote his own book called The Holy Science, in which he describes and clarifies the period of one cycle of the four yugas. So it's 24,000 years, and the first 12,000 years would be the descending cycle, and then the next 12,000 years would be the ascending cycle. So at the moment we are in the ascending cycle, and this is where we are right now, according to Sri Yukteswar Giri. This is exactly where we are right now. So you can see that there's the Satyuga, which is the golden age, where we are the closest to the Vishnu Nabi. And then when we are the furthest from the Vishnu Nabi is the Kalyuga, which is the Iron Age. And this is when mankind's consciousness is at its grossest. Whereas when we are closest to the Vishnu Nabi, the inhabitants of this planet, our consciousness is at its highest in terms of being unified. So as the previous slide showed, as the sun gets closer to the black hole, the Vishnu Nabi, we are in the ascending cycle. And then as the sun starts moving away from the Vishnu Nabi, the earth goes in the descending cycle. So just so we recall, the four yugas are the Kalyuga, which is the Iron Age, then the Dwaparyuga, when our consciousness becomes a little bit higher, for lack of a better term, then the Tretayuga, and then the Satyuga. Now, the good news is that these yugas are not equal in length. The Kalyuga is the smallest in length, and it lasts only 2,400 years. The Bronze Age or the Dwaparyuga lasts twice as long. It lasts 4,800 years. And this is the time when the people on this planet start to realize the physical laws such as electricity and magnetism. According to Sri Yukteswar Giri, we entered the Dwaparyuga in the ascending cycle around the year 1700. And that if you think about it, corresponds roughly to the Renaissance when we started rediscovering these physical laws. The Silver Age or the Tretayuga lasts even longer for 7,200 years. And this is when we start moving towards better realization, a more complete realization of our unity with God and divinity. And then finally, the Golden Age is the longest in the cycle. And at this point, the inhabitants are completely unified with each other. Many of our great stories and legends that live on in our memory as of now, in my opinion, seem to come from or may come from the last great Satyuga or from the Tretayuga. So once again, guys, just to refresh our memory, this is the complete cycle, and we are in the ascending cycle right now, which means that the sun is getting closer and closer to the Vishnu Nabi. And right now we are right here. So right before we entered the Dwaparyuga, we were in the Kalyuga. And the Kalyuga is part of the Dark Ages in Western history. So we are moving away from the Dark Ages, we have moved into the Dwaparyuga, and as we keep evolving, as our technology keeps evolving, we will keep moving further and further in the ascending cycle. So this is a really important slide because it talks about the historic periods and which yuga each one corresponds to. So the last Satyuga was a very long time ago. It ended around 6700 BC. And after that there was the Tretayuga, and we don't really have much recollection of information from here except maybe distant legends of giants and you know creatures that lived a long time, fantastic creatures, magical powers, and so on. The Dwaparyuga, the last Dwaparyuga in the descending cycle, happened from around 3000 BC to about 700 BC. And that is when we sort of have some history. And then, of course, the Kalyuga started around 700 BC. That's about 2700 years ago. And in the descending part of the cycle, it went up to about 500 AD. And then from 500 to about 1700 AD was also the Kalyuga. And this roughly corresponds to the Dark Ages and mankind moving away from the Dark Ages. And of course, as of now, since about 1700 AD, we are in the Dwaparyuga and we are making rapid technological progress, and we are moving towards the end of the Dwaparyuga, which will happen around around 4100 AD. So it's helpful to focus on some of the beings that came to help us during this cycle. So Abraham, by all accounts, was here around 1700 BC, lived to be about 200 years old, and clearly was part of the descending Dwaparyuga. Zarathushtra again came later when we were moving closer to Kalyuga. Krishna around the same time. Buddha came in the Kalyuga, towards the beginning part of the Kalyuga, and Christ came later. And of course, Buddha and Christ had shorter lives than the beings that came before. So now let's take a look at the religions that have occurred. So let's start with Sanatan Dharma, which is now called Hinduism. And a lot of the ideas in the Vedas came from the last Dwaparyuga, and they were handed through word of mouth. And just prior to the start of the Kalyuga, Ved Vyas compiled the Vedas into written form, perhaps to help us through the Kalyuga. Judaism, which was also founded during the last Dwaparyuga around 1700 BC by Abraham, really started becoming monotheistic well into the Kalyuga. And Christianity, of course, was created in the Kalyuga. So one thing we can observe is that these monotheistic religions, starting from Judaism and then Christianity and so on, that talk about there being one God who must be called by a certain name, and the separation of humans from divinity, uh, were helpful concepts during the Kalyuga, when the consciousness of the beings on this planet, the humans, was at its, or has been at its grossest physical level, where all they thought about was food and shelter. As we move into the current Dwaparyuga, you can see that the religions have changed also and have become much more open towards uh, there being different faces of God. And as we move towards the New Age philosophies, you can see that it's much more open. You can also go back now and think about the old religions that during the Kalyuga were called myths. So like the Roman and the Greek mythology, which were actually religions, they're actually fairly similar to Sanatan Dharam in that they have many different gods that play many different roles. And during the Kalyuga, when the monotheistic religions were dominant, these old religions were somewhat derogatorily classified as myths. So as we know and we see often on TV, there's a lot of old wonderful buildings that exist, and not just buildings but other structures and technologies that exist on this planet that we cannot explain. For example, the pyramids, how were they actually built? The Sphinx, how was it actually built? Now, if you look at the date of these structures around 2500 BC, you can see that it's at the beginning part of the last Dwaparyuga. So the technologies used to build these probably came not only from the Dwaparyuga but even the earlier Tretayuga. And some people nowadays believe that it was sound-based energy techniques that were used to build these structures. The Kailasa temple in Ellora, which is an absolutely wonderful structure, was or is thought to have been built around 750 AD. And there's a lot of wonderful structures in India that were built around the same time. For example, in Hampi and so on. There's the iron pillar in India which does not rust. Things that defy science right now. So you can see that these technologies existed in India later than in Egypt, so well into the Kalyuga. So is it possible that knowledge was preserved in India during the Kalyuga? Would this explain why during the last Kalyuga, India was by far the richest country on the planet? So we have a few takeaways from this. The first is that our lives, which are nothing but projections of consciousness, actually change and are affected by the cosmos, and specifically the gravitational forces that are being exerted on us by the Vishnu Nabi, the navel of Vishnu. Sanatan Dharam is the old way that comes from the last Dwaparyuga. Subsequent monotheistic Abrahamic religions are useful for the Kalyuga, or were useful for the Kalyuga, but as we have moved back into the Dwaparyuga, these are being replaced by a unity consciousness starting from Martin Luther and moving towards the current New Age religions. And in a sense, we are becoming more dharmic. Of course, as we are in the ascending cycle, we are going to be getting closer and closer to the Vishnu Nabi, and over the next few thousand years, the beings on earth will become more and more self-realized. And the technologies that we are using and building right now are part of this particular cycle to help us move towards that consciousness. But at the same time, it's important to remember that all of this is a cycle. If you look back at some of the great texts like the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, they talk about technologies that existed in the last cycle. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Don't forget to subscribe and tell your friends.